Hello everybody. So round two. Thank you very much for your patience. Yes, I'm going to talk to you about the role of omega-3 fats during neurodevelopment and the potential impact. Pardon? Oh, right, okay. On public health. Moving swiftly on. So when I talk about neurodevelopment, what I mean is the processes that generate, shape, and reshape the central nervous system right from the earliest stages of embryogenesis to the final stages of life. And this process of neurodevelopment is mediated by a multitude of factors, genetic and metabolic diseases, immune disorders, deprivation, physical trauma, environmental factors, including toxicity, and last but not least, by nutritional factors. So the focus of my presentation today is on the specialized and rather unique role of omega-3 highly unsaturated fatty acids in the developing brain and the potential implication of inadequate levels in public health. So I'm just going to draw you right back to basics for a moment, and many of you will be privileged to know, working in the field of nutrition, that the brain is the fattest organ in the body. It comprises approximately 70% lipid, of which 20 to 30% of neuronal membranes are made up of these specialized fats. And these fats play complex and varied functions throughout the central nervous system, including cell signaling. For example, 70% of the myelin sheath is coated in omega-3 fatty acids. They also play a role in gene expression and in other neurotransmitter functions, including serotonin and dopamine. And DHA is thought to specifically increase neuronal responses by enhancing the flexibility of cell membranes. So the peak vulnerability to harm from nutritional deficiencies occurs during pregnancy when the central nervous system is first developing, and we know that the quality of the maternal diet is particularly dependent on a range of micronutrients, including those listed for you. So during both the last trimester of pregnancy and the first 18 months of life, there's this DHA and arachidonic acid build up quite rapidly throughout the central nervous system, and then post-birth during the transfer of milk via the mother. And this perinatal increase in cortical DHA really coincides with very active periods of synaptogenesis, axonal myelination, and neurogenesis. So I've just cherry-picked a few of the studies just to confirm what we already know, and that early dietary intervention with DHA can result in improved cognitive development, including the ability to problem solve, and also that maternal fish intake during pregnancy is also associated with an improvement in developmental outcomes. There was a particularly interesting study by Caspi et al. 2007 who found that breastfed babies had a higher IQ, and that this association was moderated by a genetic variant in the FADS2 gene, which is involved in the genetic control of fatty acid pathways. So the take-home message here was that these babies had higher IQ due to the fatty acid content of their mother's breast milk. And this slide from Dr. Hibbelin really just confirms that relationship. Here we see that those mothers eating let me just go forward again, eating no seafood or less than 340 grams a week had children who scored in the lowest quartile for a range of developmental outcomes, including verbal IQ, prosocial development, and motor skills. So what then are the implications of inadequate omega-3s to the brain? Well, certainly in animal studies, the results are very compelling and well replicated, and I'm just going to talk through a few of these today. So a process called neuronal migration, inadequate omega-3 has caused a delay in this, and what this is really just a process in which the neurons in the brain arrive at their predetermined position, and this disruption is thought to lead potentially to cognitive, motor, and intellectual disabilities. And this slide quite nicely illustrates that. Here we see in the DHA adequate diet a nice healthy pattern of neuronal migration, and that's in stark contrast to the DHA deficient diet on the right there. So other implications of inadequate levels of omega-3 to neurodevelopment include something called disrupted dendritic aberration. And what this essentially means is here you can see this nerve cell with a nice, healthy, tree-like pattern, the dendrites there. So any interruption in this process can affect cell signaling. We've also found abnormal neuronal development in the hippocampus, which is a brain region crucial for memory and learning. We also know that omega-3 deficiency can lead to both alterations in dopaminergic and serotonergic systems in the brain, including a 40 to 60% depletion of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens alone. And this slide, again, is just a visual demonstration of that depletion here. So now I'm going to turn to neurodevelopmental disorders in children. And what I mean by neurodevelopmental disorder is really just an impairment in the growth and development of the brain or central nervous system. And these disorders are also referred to as a disorder of brain function in the way that they affect emotion, the capacity to learn, and memory. And often these disorders are not immediately apparent, but rather they unfold as the infant develops. And here's a great big long list view of all the different neurodevelopmental disorders. But today I'm going to focus specifically on just one of them, and that's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So what then is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? Well, it's a chronic and complex neurodevelopmental disorder with multifaceted symptoms. It has a global prevalence of between 5 and 13% in all school children cross-culturally. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, Volume 5, and the International Classification of Diseases, Volume 10, there are 2 recognized subtypes, and these are the predominantly inattentive and the hyperactive impulsive. And symptoms are observable certainly by the age of 12. They often manifest around the age of 5 and 6, and in chronic situations they are apparent around the age of 2. So I'm just going to briefly give you some of the characteristics of the different subtypes. So we'll start with the hyperactive impulsive type. And these children, they really struggle to sit still for any length of time. They often show lots of low-level disruptive behavior in the classroom. They're fidgeting, tapping, squirming, general restless behavior. They also lose interest in assigned tasks very, very quickly. They have difficulty following instructions. They repeat a lot of the same mistakes over and over. They're prone to talking excessively, making frequent and repetitive interruptions in the conversations of others. They're unable to play quietly. They're quite boisterous. They're described as if driven by a motor, and they also have impairments in motivation and reward responses, so they don't respond in the same way that you and I do in terms of rewards. I'll give you a translational example. If you ask a child with ADHD if they'd like to earn $20 today, or they could have $40 if they can wait till the end of the month, they will almost always choose the smaller immediate reward as opposed to the future delayed one. And that's a highly replicated finding in both children and adults, and I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. So now turning to the inattentive subtype, this is the child who has its head in the clouds, it's the daydreamer, it has an inability to pay close attention to detail, they make careless mistakes, fail to complete schoolwork, they have difficulty paying attention even when spoken to directly, they appear not to be listening, they fail to complete chores around the home. If you ask this child to go and tidy its room, come back 5 minutes later and it's completing a jigsaw puzzle or doing something altogether different. And even when refocusing the attention, the same pattern happens again. So this general absent-minded behavior really does create absolute chaos in the young person's life, and it's completely debilitating. So what then are the risk factors of this disorder and the impact on public health? Well, often these children have failed educationally. They're socially excluded and rejected from a lot of activities at school, and this can lead to gravitation towards a delinquent peer group, and then the potential of more serious conduct disorder behaviours developing, which can eventually lead to criminal behaviours. We know already that increasing number of clinical studies are showing an absolute disproportionate number of these young people now incarcerated, and they also have a tendency to develop addictive behaviours, and common drugs of choice are alcohol, nicotine, marijuana and cocaine. And this is really considered in the literature as a way of self-medicating. It's actually called the gateway hypothesis. So the cost of ADHD to society and the healthcare system is quite literally staggering, and it's calculated in the regions of tens of billions of US dollars every single year. So what then are the treatment options given, the huge risk factors associated with this disorder? Well, currently they're behaviour therapy, such as cognitive behaviour therapy, which can be mildly beneficial. You can also hire a life coach if you have lots of money, someone who can work persistently with the child throughout childhood and into adolescence in an attempt to modify behaviours, and of course stimulant medication. But we know already that psychostimulant medication is only effective in something in the region of 40 to 60% of all school children, and that leaves a proportion of children who are either treatment resistant or non-responders. So what then? Well, there's a growing body of research that suggests that potentially omega-3 has a role in the treatment of children with ADHD, and we know this because of a recent meta-analysis which showed that in 699 children with ADHD across 10 randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials, there was a small to modest effect size in reducing clinical symptoms of ADHD. We also know that low levels blood levels of omega-3 in children and young adults have been found, although the reasons for this are less unclear. Further investigations are still needed to find out whether they simply reflect dietary differences or perhaps there's evidence for a metabolic abnormality. So this then is some data from a clinical project that I carried out at King's College London, where I did my PhD. And as you can see here, there were highly significant group difference in this cohort of children with and without ADHD. And this pattern was found in both omega-6 and omega-3, potentially pointing to some sort of metabolic abnormality. There's been some speculation this could be due to impairment of the delta-5 and delta-6 desaturase, but you would need to really investigate using something like stable isotope to map and trace the absorption of omega-3 to draw any firm conclusions. So another part of my clinical project at King's College, I wanted to look at callous and unemotional traits. Now, callous and unemotional traits are a risk factor for the later development of psychopathy, and given that children with ADHD are at greater risk of developing conduct disorder behaviour, it's worthwhile investigating. So in a small cohort of male adolescents, almost half met criteria for medium to high risk of conduct disorder, and I found that low omega-3 fatty acids were negatively associated with scores of callous and unemotional traits, and I'll be showing you a diagram of that. But really, given the implications of unmanaged ADHD, the future clinical measurement of both omega-3 and callous and unemotional traits may be worth investigating. So these are the relationships I found, and as you can see here, you've got the percentage level of fatty acids on the x-axis and the callous and unemotional on the y, and as you can see, low omega-3 was negatively associated with high scores of callous and unemotional traits, and a similar pattern was found here for the total omega-3. This is the total omega-3, and for DHA. So I also wanted to look at omega-3 and assessments of brain function. So I wanted to compare the neuronal activity of the brain whilst the children were undergoing some sort of cognitive or emotion processing task to see whether there were differences in the way that they processed. And in this case, it was an emotion processing task, so in the way that they processed emotions. And I chose an emotion processing task specifically because we know already that children with ADHD have emotional dysregulation. That means that they're very hot-headed, they're very prone to huge emotional outbursts, and they really struggle to regulate their emotions. And also because there is already evidence on a behavioural level to suggest that children with ADHD really struggle to read social cues. They don't pick up on the emotional expression expressions of their peers. And this is another factor that gets them into trouble at school. So if the teacher's showing how cross she is with that child, a normal child would, modify their behaviour and stop what they were doing, but a child of ADHD just continues and continues. So this is just a picture of a child looking passively at different emotional expressions. So the facial expressions I chose depicted fear, anger, happiness, sadness, and a neutral face. And what I found, I'm just going to show you data from the N4 wave. N just really refers to a negative going wave, and 400 just refers to the milliseconds post-stimulus onset. So as you can see here, ADHD is the grey box and the healthy controls are the white. As you can see, there were significant differences, group difference in activation to the emotional expressions, and in all cases across the board, as predicted, the children with ADHD just had less negative going responses. So their responses were dampened, and the N4 wave really captures the holistic experience. It reflects the semantics, so the meaning of the emotional expression. And the children with ADHD just weren't able to produce the same responses. So then what? Then I thought, well, maybe this is related to their omega-3 levels. So I also measured the omega-3 in their blood and to establish whether there were any significant relationships or associations between the activity of their brain. And there were, and we found that there were negative associations suggesting that as omega-3 increased, the N4 responses became more negative. So in other words, more similar to that observed in the healthy control group. So this was difficult data to interpret, but after some speculation, my theory was that maybe omega-3 has a modulating effect on the observed neuronal responses, which were dampened potentially due to alterations in neurotransmitter functions, which we already know to be impaired in ADHD. So what next? How do we advance this research? Well, Joe and I, for the last 8 or 9 months, have been designing plans for an exciting trial. It's called the Neuroimaging Omega-3 and Reward in Adults with ADHD trial. And what we're particularly interested in is reward-related processes, because we know that they're impaired in children and adults with ADHD. We also know that omega-3 deficiency results in a decreased number of dopamine-derived D2 receptors in the ventral striatum, which is an area of the brain, or if you like, it's the reward hub of the brain. So we want to see whether we can give high-dose omega-3 for 16 weeks. We scan the brain using functional magnetic resonance imaging, and then we send them off with either a placebo or an omega-3, and then they come back, and we want to see whether we can increase ventral striatal bulb activation. So basically I hope that I'll be able to come back in the future and give you the results of this trial. In the meantime, I just want to say thank you very much for your patience and your attention, and also acknowledge my colleagues, everyone at the NIH, and in particular to Dr. Joseph Hiblin, who's a wonderful mentor, and I'm very happy to be working with him on this trial. So thank you very much, everybody.